So I'm going to tell everybody that I'm here with Mercurious and we're going to talk about some stuff. Can you tell me just what is the universe?
The universe is many voices.
Oh, I already love that, but I always want. So when you say many voices, what does that mean?
It is also many voices unified. Uni being one, voice, verse. Um, if we look at the etymological roots of these concepts, we're talking always about unity. And this concept is principal to what is going on now. You know, what is the Unity Project? What is unity? What is oneness? What is the unified mind, which is, you know, the concept of the noosphere of Teilhard de Chardin, which starts emerging with and alongside the idea of the hive mind, which is a very uh, interesting, very Rosicrucian notion that flourishes in, you know, the speculative age, which is, well, everything up until the modern age, really. The speculative tradition is something that is really quite important, particularly around the 13th century, where you've got people like Roger Bacon in England and Raymond Lullis um, in he was Catalonian, wasn't he? Spanish. And both of those two people are very key to what is occurring in the mindset. Roger Bacon reveals that the unity is in the disciplines, and he actually reveals also that there is a fear that it is the unity, the revelation of the unity of the disciplines that would lead to social destabilization if that was revealed, the unity of the disciplines.
Mm.
So this notion of the unity of the disciplines also harks back to the concept of Thoth, who is the god creator of all disciplines. You know, he creates mathematics, he creates medicine, he creates all of the disciplines that and when I look at Thoth now, I I see that entity as a complete thought form.
Mhm.
In fact, I see all of these entities as thought forms. Ra, for example, um, if you look simply at the structure of the graphic hieroglyph, it is literally the Vesica Piscis. That is it. So what is the Vesica Piscis? And of course that is, you know, that lens that occurs when you unify two circles, and when the points of the two circles share the radius, the centers enclose the radius. Those centers are associated, if you are taking it back to the astronomy, this is where the original model comes from, where you're taking the longest and the shortest day, which is the two extremes of your annular cycle, which is what Copernicus used, it's what Ptolemy used, it's what Vitruvius gives in his diagram for building a sundial. And of course, it's exactly the same structure, but it's not fleshed out in detailed form. None of these things are, because there is this inherent blasphemy that is, anyone who reads Timaeus, Plato's Timaeus, understands that, you know, if that which is true is blasphemous, then it is to the copy that the artificer looks. I mean, that is the statement that he says just before he gives you a reverse engineering of what the artificer has done, which is taking this part away and that part away, and the part that was a third of the whole, and ultimately shows you that the two circles are pulled apart and separated. And so you have a very interesting problem involving how we see the two-body problem that is the Earth-Sun relationship, and that is a system as a whole. The Earth-Sun relation is a system. That system is a two-body problem, if we're going to just reduce it into really general terms. The two bodies are the relationship between a luminous and a reflective body, and what that relationship provides are signatures. Now, we've got to think of what a signatory authority that underwrites a contract or law is, because this is where we start to understand the principles of sovereignty, or a monarch's position of which, if we go back to ancient Egyptian principles and the unification of the twin land, the monarch was not so much a despotic role. It was a role that represented both the male and the female of the population. It was also to mediate between what was considered a natural emergence of corruption, inevitably a natural emergence, because your governing officials are the ones that are privy to all the information about what is going to happen in the immediate future, what is going to happen in the, in the projected short-term future, and what is going to happen in the major future. So, like any government situation, your bureaucrats are privy to information that the general population has no idea about, unless there is a process through which that information is told to everybody. And so then there are degrees of enfranchisement of the people, which begins with enfranchising corporate entities, company bodies, and again, if we go back to Egypt before the idea of a company or a corporation, it was to those people who were adept in the geometrical reckonings that inform the linguistic code itself, because the linguistic code is made up of very abstract concepts as well as pictographic identities that are directly indicating the object. But is it a direct indication or not? I mean, a serpent is not just a serpent. It's also a waveform. It's also, the shape of the anatomical shape of the tongue. Whether it's the cobra or the viper, it has different meaning fields, and the meaning fields of every character is vast. And that's what Thomas, who was the I'm just thinking of the other guy who was involved in Thomas Young, who was deciphering the hieroglyphs in the early 19th century. Is it Thomas Young or Arthur Young? I think it's Thomas Young. He recognized that every character was pregnant with information. Mm-hmm. Now, that was not what the mainstream information wanted to come down into the general public at all. Because once you realize that they're pregnant with information, you can't just have a general meaning of a term. So, the five-spoked wheel, which is a star,
Hmm.
is it does have a general meaning, a general indication to all stars generally, but it also
Has a
has a meaning,
multi-dimensional definition.
yeah, and that hieroglyph is transliterated SBA, Sibar. It means teacher or teachings, and it indicates astronomical teachings, your star teachings. So when you have a statement, we want to return to the stars, which is what contemporary exopolitics sort of look back at ancient Egypt and go, everyone from Atlantis, everyone from Egypt, the knowledge system is extraterrestrial because, they came from the stars and they wanted to return to the stars. No, return to the teachings was return to the astronomical teachings that underpin the whole system of a complex sedentary culture, the entire system, where if you completed the training, you were given a completed fabric, and the completed fabric was what you wore over your shoulder as an indication that you were a sage in Greece, or it continues right through many cultural traditions, and even in Scotland, the wearing of the completed fabric over the shoulder, and it being a wonderful tartan, which can literally be shown to come off a harmonic code when you remap things. So, when I'll tell you the reason why I did this work, working as a philosopher in the 1990s, very aware of the emergence of all of the alternative renderings of, what quantum physics is indicating. So, you had the holographic principle, the whole idea of the anthropic principle, and, this rendering of, what is it? Is it consciousness or is it matter? Always this separation of the two things that are the aspects of the whole. When you separate those two things and you go, well, it's either consciousness or it's matter, you've got to see this as red flags,
So
because that's
they
like saying,
with any when the divide happens, or when even if you've just got two separate, if you got binary, there's got to be some form of signatory authority. There's got to be some sort of communication, and there's got to be crossover between the two.
yeah. And the interesting thing is that these signatures, which are nomic, you need a nomic instrument. Now, the history of a nomic instrument has not been written, because in our minds, we think only of a stick placed in the ground, right? Or, the gnomon as the indicator on a sundial. So when we think of the term gnomon, we don't think of how the technology of a gnomon itself has changed. And that is all of our instruments that we have developed that give us access to immaterial phenomena that shows us information about the relationships between something that is luminous and something that is reflective. So if it's a scan of your cells, you're looking for the relationship between luminous and reflective attributes. So, this goes down through our entire knowledge system. When we're thinking about what that phenomena is, we also know that it's immaterial, because it doesn't actually exist until we mark the data.
Mm-hmm.
So the line of time, if we draw it from dawn till dusk, so we're standing really slowly, we're drawing our line in as the nomic information moves from relatively infinite speed to really, really slow at noon, which is the moment, the most precious moment, where we can actually, by looking at the speed of the shadow at noon, which doesn't hold, it's the speed of the earth we're witnessing.
Mm.
And that's actually how we get the physical constant of the speed of the earth's rotation. There's no other way we can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But we're not told this because our knowledge system has to be generalized because we are applying it to all disciplines all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're constantly in a process of generalization, simplification, because, there is a difference between, a weird brain that gets fixated on some problem and a more general brain that is, doing other things, and neither are different. One's focus on some, you could be a complete freak if you, like someone like me. I can't interact with a lot of people because my mindset is completely different, and it comes from my whole life of research, which began with very esoteric information. I was writing essays about, Thoth and,
Yeah, I
alchemy.
feel
And
you. I feel you completely. I feel you because I think it comes to it comes down to the more information that you take in as a human and the more you unblock yourself, because lots of humans just want to go around in their life and they block information coming in. They don't want to know the truth. They literally, and then we term it that way, but really they're just blocking information coming in because it would take them away from doing something over here or something over here that they currently enjoy doing, or they're indoctrinated into doing. And then comes if the more information you take in, I have a really hard time properly communicating. If I have a proper conversation about intelligence services or anything like that with
yeah,
the average person, the conversation is not going to be easy, and usually
you
the
don't
other
even
person
have a
is gets
ladder.
scared. Yeah, yeah.
Don't even have a ladder to step on. There isn't
And there's a
even
lot of fear.
a
There's a lot of
first
people
step.
who will just run away from information. They just realize, okay, that's just way too much information for my brain to take. So I'm not going to want to try to learn how to take in that level of information. I understand completely.
Now, if you then think about revolution, your most powerful group to affect whatever change you're wanting to occur is your youngest generation that is of working age, because they have not had the time to research the fullness of their discipline, let alone be given that information in the first place. So if you've got, it only takes 22 years to completely take control over a population. That's all
Hmm.
it takes.
Yeah,
That was known in ancient Egypt. The
yeah.
last Queen Hatshepsut reigned for 22 years. Her project was not to appear as if she was a male by wearing a beard. The wearing of the beard was a direct indication of the earth god Geb, who is the only representation of a god with a beard, right? Who is always shown with his legs striding and looking in the opposite direction to where he's going. And so if we think about the most famous images of Geb, his phallus supports the arc of the sky goddess,
Oh,
right?
wow.
But his legs are running in the stride of the greatest cycle,
Mm.
and he's looking in the opposite direction of where he's running. He looks like he is being raped by a succubus or some evil female entity. Now, this is where interpretation of images becomes really problematic, because you have in the 1st century AD a really, really strong hatred of Egypt. They actually considered Egypt to be a land of evil people, right? Partly this comes out of all of the narratives of Exodus and, you know, what happened with the slave trade and, you know, what was going on. But people forget Egypt is a ranging civilization that ranges over thousands and thousands of years, that begins its formal life as a unified twin land in the 4th millennium BC, which is right at the beginning, mind you, yet it's already existed well before that unification in that space. But the unification is not only the foundational underpinnings of a political organization unifying 2 lands, the upper land and of course it's the lower land that in the southern part of the Nile, that is the expansionist environment that can keep going down the river further and further and expand the empire, which is not really an empire in the sense of, you know, going and claiming somebody else's land, stealing it off them, taking their resources and enslaving their populations. That's, you know, it's not like the colonization imprint that we have, which is also well in play, well before the Greeks colonized the land of Greece, the Ionian colonies and so on. So, you know, colonization is something that comes into play in the 1st millennium BC, which is the time period where writing is emerging in other cultures, in imperial cultures. So nothing was written down in Sanskrit before 1000 BC. Nothing was written down in Chinese.
Were the first things to be written, this Egypt, we got to look out for them, they're trouble.
Yeah, so, you know, when we're looking at the emergence of written codes, the emergence in India and the first real items of philosophical tracts are between 900 and 600 BC. So, you know, this is the period which one would consider is the rebirth of the Greek culture, you know, the period that is considered the re-emergence from a so-called dark age. Well, what is the dark age? Something happened. The Minoan civilization ended. The Mycenaean civilization ended. The island of Thera exploded around, what, 14 BC, 1400 BC. So, you know, a lot of people go, oh, that must be Atlantis. Plato was wrong.
When you say exploded, do you mean literally explodes?
Well, there was a volcanic eruption on the island of Thera or Santorini, and that eruption is likely the cause of, you know, a catastrophic rupture in those in that particular region. And so you have an end point and then a re-emergence, and we're only really discovering the re-emergence through writers that traveled to Egypt, because the Greeks haven't even made up their fucking alphabet yet, right?
Yeah.
They haven't even they haven't even organized what shapes and forms they're going to use, or how they're going to distinguish
That must
between
have been
the
such an
hard.
exciting time in these countries, this like evolution of language in like the basic form. I read about the Korean language, the modern Korean language was invented by a king of Korea at some point. He went through to decided we've got to have our own language if we're going to be taken
Yeah, yeah,
serious. Like that idea of creating a language, coming up to the idea we need to create something, we need to actually be able to write down what we're saying, and it's obviously
why?
affected
Because
by
they've been
the
doing it for
neighbors.
fucking thousands of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
years
yeah, yeah, yeah.
in these magnificent cultures. Like
Mm-hmm.
Egypt messes with our mind because we can't come to terms with, you know, why was there this sudden emergence of extraordinary science?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Extraordinary science. Now,
So
a
why
lot of
was
people say,
it?
oh,
What?
well,
Yeah.
people say, oh, it was just the discovery of metallurgy, where you could blend metals
Mm-hmm.
together. And so you have this just so story about the emergence of alchemy. And no, I'm sorry, this is not what happens at all. When you start to understand what informs both cuneiform, because you've got cuneiform happening very much at a similar emergent time as the consolidation of the first hieroglyphic code, which is pre-dynastic. So you've got a definitive period shift occurs with Snefru, SNFRU is the transliteration of his name. He was the first pyramid
Sniffer.
builder. Well, Nefer as in Nefertiti,
Oh, right.
is a very important concept.
Mm-hmm.
Nefer and Neter are the two concepts associated to God.
Mm. Oh.
Nefer is the good and the beautiful. So when Plato talks about God, he keeps referring to it as the good and the beautiful.
It's not
Now
just good.
that's
It's
literally the translation of Nefer.
Mhm.
Nefer is the other problem you need to recognize with ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs is that they were really into symmetry, but not just as above, so below, which is the common symmetry,
Mm.
a single line of symmetry or a single plane of symmetry as
Mhm.
above, so below. The ancient Egyptians were to the left, to the right, above, below, in front, behind. So they
Mm.
were always aware of a three-dimensional, two-dimensional
They were
relationship.
really into dimensions. They were.
Yeah, and this is really interesting too, because if you think or presume that a two-dimensional image is simply two-dimensional and does not have any information associated to any sort of three-dimensional construct, you are very misinformed, because if and again, this is to do with the way we understand geometry and space itself and what the limits of space are. And I mean, there is limits to the dimensionality of space, and even though from the early 1900s the use of the word dimension seems to take on a whole other realm
Mm.
of meaning. What is the dimension of, I mean, this idea of there being infinite dimensions, or what is the fourth dimension, which is what Ouspensky and Gurdjieff were very much involved in trying to rationalize. And these were
I've seen it.
spiritual.
I've seen it in Paris. The building. I can't remember what it's called. It's like a building with a hole within it, and it's supposed to represent the fourth dimension. But I mean, I've seen the fourth dimension, but it's not really the fourth dimension,
Yeah,
I think.
yeah. But when you look at the structural attributes, what's really interesting, if I can point this to the camera in a way
Hmm.
that that line disappears, right? So this is literally the structure that comes out of the geometry. This is what the Pythagorean cube is. It's a cube if you consider that each of those sides is a face of a cube, but it's only an inferred cube, because what it actually is two isometric matrices, meaning two measures, the measure of that length, which is on the diagonal of the square face, and the measure of this length, which is on the diagonal enclosed by the vertices of a cube. And those two measures are indications of there being two lattice structures interconnected in such a way that both expand out, both one is actually dividing the other. Well, no, it's not actually. That's
it's very complicated. Yeah.
It's just so fucking beautiful. But anyway, what I was saying about the fourth dimension is that there are four axes in this other matrix structure. Those axes, if you think of 6 pyramids all pointing to the middle, and the faces of the pyramids inferring the faces of the cube, the apex of the pyramids is the center, and the lines that run down the sides of the pyramids are these lines here. So we're not looking at an indication of 4-dimensional lines. We're simply indicating the difference between the 3D gestalt of the 2D image that is drawn on the ground plane. The picture plane is the ground plane. Because our original data set is marking every day, and so we end up with 3 significant lines. The line of the longest and shortest days of the year, they're our extremes, and the line of the means, which is 2 days, but they fall on the same line. So you get 4, or a quadration of the annular cycle becomes 3 lines, one that exhibits positive curvature, one that exhibits 0 curvature, and the other exhibits negative curvature, right? So when we think of contemporary ideas in what is the shape of space, is space positive curvature, negative curvature, or 0 curvature, it actually has a precedent which goes right back to drawing data on the ground plane from a stick in the ground. And not only that, the stick in the ground is our act of objectifying. You see, where we have a shadow, I could pretend to be the Nomen if I wanted to stay in that place for a year or more so that all the data could be gathered off me, yeah? But if I'm a scientist and I need to have this data, and I'm simply using an identity rod that replaces my body, and I stick that in the ground, then I become a scientist revealing all the data that is both visible and intelligible. Now, when we start thinking about knowledge from those 2 separate divisions, what is visible, what appears to be true, and what is intelligible, which can lead us to very counterintuitive facts that lead us into a completely opposite conclusion to what appears to be true. And these are the two categories that Plato actually sets up, and that Aristotle leaves. He can't. Why can't Aristotle work with those two categories that enable us to understand that we are able to have objective facts? We are able to access objective truth because we are able to gather data that we can't influence. That's a very important fact. We can't influence the speed of the rotation of the planet or the orbit around the sun, even though a lot of magicians would like to think they can.
Yeah.
And there's many that would say, oh, if everyone in the world thought the same thing, if everybody had one mind, we could change the rotation of the earth. We could, this is magical thinking, and it comes from the experience of, manipulating things in ways and means that seem to be magical because we don't necessarily understand electromagnetics, right? So, when Haeckel talks about the soul in matter, what he's referring to is the discovery of liquid crystals. And liquid crystals are really weird. They're not solid. They're not really liquid. And they do weird shit. Like you put your finger near a bubble of liquid crystal and it will be attracted to your finger.
What do they define it as? If it's not, is it some sort of super something? If it's not solid, or if it's not liquid, is that why they call, what do they call that state?
It's a quasi-crystal.
Right, okay.
It's sort of like mercury is a quasi-crystal, and if you put it into certain conditions of temperature and freeze it, you'll be able to see what the crystal structure is. And this is solid state physics. Solid state means you need to observe your substance. You are wanting to see what its crystallographic structure is, what its fundamental material structure is. And so if it's water, you're going to freeze it. And as we know with not only, Emoto is just a more recent researcher fucking around with all the different crystal structures that you can get out of water. But if you go back to Jacques Benavista, in the 80s, this is an incredibly important subject because he was offering an avenue into understanding the peculiar mystery of homeopathy and the idea that information can be encoded into a fluid like water. Right? That there is some memory in that, and that you can see that there may not even be any molecules of what is creating that information in the substance that you're dealing with, but there is a signature which is the structure. Right? So what Benavista was doing was really, really profound. And what Nature magazine did to him was also really profound because they destroyed his career.
They're not who is involved with Nature magazine? Why are they so naughty?
Well, who indeed? They brought Maddox. John Maddox was the editor at the time. They brought him out of retirement to deal with this little problem. Right? And then they got Randy the magician from the USA.
Oh, he's got a history. He has got a history, yeah.
Yeah. And what they did was so bogus.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm laughing because it's so bogus.
No, you have to laugh. It's so tragic. All of these tragic stories are laughable because they show how easily manipulated, how easily hoodwinked the ordinary person is. Because, you you take a fucking magician like Randy the magician, right? Who's a eugenicist, who has overtly said that, you know, we need to depopulate the world. Now, how he is used is in the most spurious way, because they simply say, well, if he can come up with a method of creating the same results, then that means that Benavista must have also done that hoodwinking method. So completely false. I mean, if you're going to assess a scientific set of experiments that give you data that can be repeatable, you have to follow it like a fucking recipe. You know, you have to make sure that the temperature is exactly the same. You have to make sure that all of the environmental conditions, which may have a lot to do with a specific technology. You know, if you're wanting to observe a certain information, you have to take into consideration all of the environmental conditions, which includes all of the technologies you are using to source your signature information. I mean, an ultrasound gives you signature information, right?
You need to make
an ultrasound, it's a nomic instrument. So, you know, we don't have a history of the nomen. The nomen is just a stick in the sand. And if you read someone like Midjat Ghazales, who wrote Nomen from Pharaohs to Fractals, and then writes a thesis about how the nomen doesn't fucking exist and how an obelisk isn't a nomen, you know, and how the ancient Egyptians did not have this extraordinary astronomical information, because there's this program to disenfranchise Egypt. And we have to ask the question, why?
Are we still doing this then? Has this been happening progressively since the fall of Egypt? Have they been more and more destroyed? You know, we hear like that, you know, they've like certain, even the Egyptians themselves wiped off certain emperors of the past or rulers of the past from all their graves and their literature and etc. Are we doing that perpetually with Egypt for some reason?
It's almost like we've got a blueprint of how to deal with the knowledge system. And it is this, you know, once you get to a certain point, that knowledge is taken for the control system.
So it's the Winston Smith moment.
Yeah. It's, you know, what does the cutting edge mean? You're literally cutting out significant information that serves the interest of the arms race, space race dichotomy, right? Now, the ordinary population and ordinary bureaucrats and ordinary government officials cannot be privy to the machinations of the knowledge system itself, because that takes a fucking lifetime to work out anyway, and only a nutter would actually pursue such a disenfranchising career option, you know, to literally, there is a problem, and I'll name what the problem was. That we've got all of these alternative models in cosmology emerging from the 70s. We've got this emergent problem of whether or not, you know, we are just a genetically engineered species from an extraterrestrial race. You know, Carl Sagan wrote about that. You know, when I first read Sagan, I thought, oh yeah, half my library's got all of the books from exopolitics that was ever printed from the 70s on. I mean, it's like we are stuck in a 1970s paradigm. And it's like great mysteries of the world, which will never be solved. It's amazing. Like, you know, the Murdoch Industries you don't really want any of the mysteries solved, because then you can't keep printing and publishing all the books about the great mysteries that are never resolved.
Yeah.
We don't really want anyone to understand the fabric of the knowledge system, because then there's some sort of fear of finality,
It's so much
which
of
is
this
really
during that era. They're
tragic.
just through the 70s. Like a lot of the work I've done on Kissinger and others, they were paradigm setters. They were to
Yeah,
set paradigms all over the place, both media paradigms, nuclear warfare paradigms, perpetual warfare paradigms, coup paradigms, intelligence paradigms, all
yeah,
interlinking, just like it is a structure in itself that you could
absolutely.
define and was defined
And,
back
and,
then.
and and you see,
Climate paradigm. Yeah.
we make the mistake of assuming that, Carl Sagan did certain things and said certain things because he was either directed to do so, or, like, I mean, one of the problems that comes to mind is that he literally, apart from saying that, Eden was a spaceship and that, extraterrestrials likely genetically engineered, this is a remaking of the ancient myths. And if we think about written codes and the manifestation, or the narrative that it gets embodied by those written codes thousands of years later,
Mm.
but what is the narrative, therefore? These aren't just so stories. These myths and legends, like if we look at the Bhagavad Gita, or all the stories about Indra, and you get this idea that there's this massive war in the heavens, and then we've got Velikovsky telling us that, yes, the massive war in the heavens, that's where you get the asteroid belt and one of the planets gets exploded, and this is the catastrophe theory. And catastrophe theory, when first heard by Carl Sagan, he was completely against it, because he was, like everybody, inducted by his discipline to believe a certain way, and usually the first impression is all that is heard. And then he later goes, oh well, yes, there's some credence to what Velikovsky is saying. But today nobody talks about Velikovsky and catastrophe theory from that sense, because all the young ones understand is, Eric von Daniken and the Chariot of the fucking Gods and all the popular stuff that my generation was spoon fed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't changed. So, I get spoon fed with von Daniken. I read it. I'm aware of this idea that extraterrestrials are in every culture, and, that we think that, the Mayan pictographs indicate spaceships and all sorts of things. I grew up with that stuff. I was in my teenage years in the 70s. I mean, I was drinking that stuff.
Mm-hmm. No, we all were.
Um,
We all were. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
I'm from, like, I was born in 1980, but I mean, that's all we had. We had everything from the past repeats. We had things that all of the different literature around, and all of it was just, yeah, drinking up that idea.
yeah. And as we're drinking up popular notions, we're losing the, studying of the metaphysical poets. We're losing, the studying of
Hmm.
extraordinary prose and poetry that is actually giving us more
I've
hints.
I've told this story in a few podcasts about how when I was in primary school, would have been about 4 or 5 years old, and it's one of my earliest memories in school. And it was because they were talking about Stonehenge, and I was really excited. I was really excited about it. I had seen it, heard about it. People talked about it, and it was somewhere in my brain. I was like, I want to know about this, and I'm a small child, really interested. I remember that it must have been about five, and the teacher said that they were taking out Stonehenge and Roman and ancient Greece and other history out of the curriculum. So we were going to be learning about kings and queens of England, and we were going to be learning about Welsh mining communities and the revolution of the Welsh against, becoming free. So it was teaching us our masters and that we're free now from those masters. That's what it was teaching, but it wasn't teaching us any of the way to look at logic. It wasn't teaching us any of the history that actually made us in all of these. It got us to where we are now, and it's one of my earliest memories is this idea that
Which is
they're
very
taking it
interesting
out.
because if you look at someone like Sir Lancelot Hogben, who wrote Science for the Citizen, Mathematics for the Millions. I'm not sure whether the millions means the masses or the dollars. I'm pretty sure it means the dollars. But, those two books are, and he wrote many books, really interesting character because with his work, he literally defines what is British socialism of the turn of the 20th century. And it begins, Science for the Citizen, the first thing is Stonehenge.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so important because Stonehenge is an extraordinary computer.
Mm-hmm.
It is the most incredible embodiment of a mathematical system of gathering data and then creating a topologically coherent model using simple circles, because we're dealing with cycles. So it doesn't matter whether the details are wrong. When you're working with topology, a circle can be, a wiggly line in topology, as long as that line doesn't cross itself. It's topologically coherent, right? With a circle, a physical circle. So topology is really interesting because once you're starting to work out the matrix and the rulings, you realize it doesn't matter if your rulings are a little bit out of whack, and they do get out of whack the further out. If you're working on the structural attributes from the vesicapiscus, which is really, you've got 1 point here, 1 point here, and you've got the 2 points of intersection. They're the first 4 points that are real points. Euclid defines a point as that which has no parts, but that does not mean it's got no dimension.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we come into the 20th century, we destroy Euclid by getting rid of his glossary of terms and insisting that the definition of a point is a zero-dimensional entity, an imaginary object, an imaginary line, an imagined thing that does not exist. So when you have a point is that which has no parts, does not equal a point has zero dimension.
Mm-hmm.
A sphere is a structure that has no parts. It doesn't mean it's a zero-dimensional entity.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the thing with topology. If we are looking at a point in the distance, we're riding our horse to a local town, we see the first indication of that town, it might be a spire of a church or whatever, and that's our point of reference. As we get closer and closer in proximity, the details of that place, it expands in shape and size. All of a sudden we see that it is not one blob. It is not something that has no parts. It's something that has many parts.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's like a machine,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so our proximity to it is what is giving us more and more information. And I mean, this is how beautiful our knowledge system is, because we've got all of these embodied in the very foundations, which are a method of, we don't have protractors, we don't have compasses, we don't have set squares. So it's a method of, without anything but a stick that represents our own body, we are gathering data, we are studying that data, we are modeling that data, because we know in the broad light of day that we are dealing simply with something that moves, something that projects sunlight, so a luminous body, and the earth itself, which is reflective, right? So and one of them moves, right? And if we have no association to farming or the seasonal changes, if we have no information about how the year is quadrated inherently through in more temperate regions, through the changing of the seasons, if we don't understand how, you know, the information starts to drop out as you get to the northern regions of the pole, because you can only see the sun and the shadow markings on the ground for a certain period of days. So no, the northern cultures that Nietzsche sort of indicated as being the source of the Hyperboreans, who were the gifters of culture, no, they are not those who come from whence the north wind blows at all. And the word Boreas, and it takes a fucking long time to find the basic etymological foundations of Boreas, means from above. So like the Elohim and algebra, from above, right? So those three words, al, Borea, they mean from above, from the zenith, from the point at which the sun is at the highest limit. And these are about the limits of dimension. And these are rigorous constructs that we know to be true. Yet how many kids today go, there is no truth? There is no objective. How can a person be objective? You know, if seeing is believing, we can't believe what we see because it's all just a product of our, you know, dendrites firing and whatever the fuck is happening in our brains. You know, we're subject to our perception. No, we're remarkable human beings. We're remarkable entities that someone like David Attenborough has spent his whole life denying the distinction between the human species and the animal species, because there are many things that differentiate us from animals. One of the most important being the lengthy, protracted period of our dependence on our parental support system. That is one of the most important distinctions, because we are the only creature that is so reliant for so long. Why? Hazard a guess? You know, we're developing, when we are allowed to become adults one day, because, you know, at the moment, there are no adults on this planet. When we are allowed to become adults, it means that we are allowed to be inducted into the mindset that supports our civilization. That is our birthright. If we are born into a complex society, our birthright is to be inducted into that knowledge system that informs the machinations of that societal structure. And that's what we've lost.